Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Perpetual Chess. We have the opportunity this week to catch up with an American legend, U.S. Chess Hall of Famer, Grandmaster Andy Soltis. Andy, 9-time Marshall Chess Club champion, 4-time U.S. Closed Championship participant. He's an award-winning journalist and quite prolific author. He is a columnist for Chess Life magazine. He writes the Chess to Enjoy columnist, which I always enjoy, go figure. And we talk a lot about his two most recent books, Reveal Your Chess Style and Deadline Grandmaster. Deadline Grandmaster in particular is just a really fun book, really incredible memoir with lots of great stories. And I'm actually going to make a YouTube video going over one of my favorite moments from it, sharing a game. So make sure you are subbed to the YouTube channel, as well as I will also share a few more thoughts about that particular book. And we'll get you to the interview with Andy in a second. Just a couple of reminders. Number one, Andy is old school. He doesn't use Zoom. So this interview, I called him on the phone via Zoom. So those of you watching on YouTube, you will not have a visual of Andy. Those of you listening on audio, luckily the sound is loud and clear, so should be no issues there. But we'll have a still photo and an occasional illustrative image up for those of you watching on YouTube. Also wanted to mention, for those who didn't catch the news, my book, Perpetual Chess Improvement, is finally on Audible. So I've been getting emails for almost 2 years now asking, when is it going to be on Audible? When is it going to be on Audible? It's finally there. So if you have been waiting for that, first of all, thank you for your patience. And second of all, I will link to where you can get it in the Amazon/Audible store. And last but not least, I wanted to thank our sponsors, Chessable.com. Benjamin Bach, who, of course, is a top Dutch grandmaster whose streaming and commentating I often enjoy, has a course out on the Accelerated Dragon, starting out the Accelerated Dragon. I might be biased here because I grew up playing the Accelerated Dragon back in the day, but I think it's a great, very classically principled, but not too theoretical opening for if you are newer to chess. And that, of course, is just one of the many things you can check out from Chessable. And if you sign up for Chessable Pro, be sure to use the link in the description. So without further ado, we will get you to a great interview with Andy Soltis. So many stories, Bobby Fischer, Walter Browne, talking about chess peaks and plateaus, playing a young Vishy Anand, just lots of fun stories as always. Always a treat to talk with Andy. So here's my interview with him. And we are honored as always to be rejoined by the U.S. Chess Hall of Famer and prolific and award-winning author and Chess Life magazine columnist, Grandmaster Andy Soltis. Hi, Andy.
How are you doing?
I'm well. Thanks for doing this. It's always an honor. As I've told you in previous interviews, read your books growing up. So to get to interview you is a real treat.
Thanks, man.
Sure. And so I've been digging into your two most recent books, Reveal Your Chess Style, which is, of course, a very original instructional book, and Deadline Grandmaster, which is a fantastic memoir that I was looking forward to coming out, and then I just totally forgot about it. And then inhaled it in the past handful of days, and it's fantastic. And I have a lot of questions for you about the amazing stories you tell in that book, but I actually wanted to begin by discussing your most recent Chess to Enjoy column in Chess Life magazine, where you talked about something you've written about in the past as well. You talked about plateaus, and that's something that comes up a lot on this often chess improvement focused podcast. So Andy, could you share some of the conclusions you've drawn in looking at people's chess development arcs?
I think one of the main reasons people hit a plateau is they have natural talent. Everybody has a different level of natural talent, and talent will get you just to a certain point, and then you have to really reinforce it. You have to start working. A lot of young kids they benefit from a spurt when their rating goes up astronomically. You know, they're examples of a player going up 1,000 points. I think there's a young girl in England who gained some, remarkable number of hundreds of points in one single day. But eventually, you reach a point where you plateau. Your rating becomes stagnant, or it goes up a little bit and then you go down a little bit, and that's a signal to you. It's the rating system is giving you a message and telling you it's time to go back to basics. Try to figure out what went wrong, try to figure out how you can improve to get to the next level.
Yeah, you quote Joel Benjamin in your column saying I think everybody has a level of strength which they may attain without working too hard. And that puts it in somewhat stark terms. But as I thought about my own chess development, I started tournament chess when I was 12, made it to USCF Master when I was 18, and didn't work that hard on. I mean, there have been periods where I've worked hard on chess since then, but it tends to be fits and starts. And I was young then, but I didn't work especially hard in that period. I was surrounded by chess, but it wasn't work per se. And I think that, and I was competing frequently, all that stuff. But I think that that might be fairly common, especially for people who learn chess as a kid, and even as an adult. To your point, you cite 8 years as a common sort of stumbling block, where if you don't improve within 8 years, what was it you wrote that likely 90% of the gains you make would be within the first 8 years more often than not?
Yeah, I think that you reach a point, and typically it is after 8 years. For some players, it's 6 years. For some, it's 10, 12, whatever. But they've gotten to 90% of their potential rating. And to get to that, to raise it beyond that is really hard, and it's frustrating. And it comes again in spurts and small increments. I think the great Russian chess trainer Mark Dvoretzky talked about the latent accumulation of skills, and sometimes it's so latent that it's invisible. But you can improve even after you've reached what you think is your maximum. But it takes a little bit of extra work.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of extra work. And as I write in my book and constantly advise, it might not happen, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible. Recently, FM Nate Solon, who joined us in conversation when we interviewed you about Zurich 1953, he shared his rating graph. And Nate is someone who was a quite strong young player as a kid, but basically dropped chess entirely around college age, rated in the 2200s. And he came back in his 30s and he went from the 2200s to about 2450 USCF, which, as you write in your column, you write that it's really about one rung on the ladder, one sort of class up that you can realistically expect to achieve once you've passed those 8 years. And that's sort of what Nate did. But to me, it's also, he's at a level where it's more impressive. When you're at the starting level of 2250, to go to 2450 in your 30s is quite rare. And Nate, as he writes, it almost beggars belief, but he says he hasn't done anything that unusual. He hasn't worked that hard. He's just become more practical. Can you think, Andy, of other examples of people who have sort of defied the odds?
Well, I can't think of any offhand, but I think there are many ways that you can do it without actually studying. You can just stop refusing draws.
Right.
Start offering draws. Some players develop a fear of seeing their rating drop if they don't accept a draw when it's offered. That's one of the ways of doing it. And I think one of the points that's important is that your positional understanding is probably never going to decline. It's tactics that will kill you. You begin to miss things. I remember in the 90s when, to give you a grandmaster example, when Anatoly Karpov had his last peak. He had a fantastic result in a Linares tournament where he beat all the top players, and he won the tournament by like 2 points. And then he went into decline. And Vladimir Kramnik, who was, one of his rivals and ultimately a successor, said Karpov didn't lose anything in terms of positional understanding and when he went down. What happened was that he began to decline in the short tactics.
Right.
He looked 2 moves ahead, and he would just miss something that was fairly simple. And it wouldn't be a blunder. It was just like, oh, I wanted to play my knight there, and I saw 2 moves ahead. Now I realize I can't do that. That's the type of thing that you and so that refresher courses on tactics is always going to help you along the way.
Yeah, and Karpov, that Linares case is an interesting one because that was a historic result. I mean, that wasn't just like a good tournament. That was one of the best results of all time. I think he was around 43 years of age, and then who would guess that was the peak, I mean, not like he fell off the face of the earth or anything, but as you say, wasn't able to sustain that level. I think it's good. I think it's a good framework to keep in mind, this 8-year rule, although certainly don't. I love the people like Nicholas. I've interviewed this guy, Nicholas Sloan, who recently gained 400 points in his 40s and is very eager to prove that you can go from a sort of class level to the master level as an adult. as long as people have the rest of their lives in order, I love those stories, and I'd love for people to defy the odds and sort of rewrite what we think is possible. But in the meantime, I also do always advise people to temper expectations and not quit their day jobs necessarily.
I like that concept of getting your life in order. There's no rating for getting your life properly in order. I wish I could do master that.
Well, it's a big theme of your book, actually. I mean, one of the things I love about it, I'm biased because I lived in New York for a long time, and you, of course, are a lifelong New Yorker. So I know a lot of the characters. But of course, you also write about players on the international stage. But you also write about the difficult career decisions that grandmasters face, and how you, for example, took a job at the New York Post, hence the title Deadline Grandmaster, as a late night editor, and you never really thought about pursuing chess professionally, even though you've been as high as about number 70 in the world. So, how do you frame that decision as compared to some of your contemporaries who went all in on chess?
They were born at a luckier time. I think players today have more options in becoming a professional. When I was growing up, there just were very, very few people in American chess, at least, who were trying to earn a living steadily. I think there was Bobby Fischer, Art Britzkeier. For a while, had a sort of a job working for the Chess Review magazine, where he was the managing editor under Al Horowitz. And there were others who inched along, adding income from doing various jobs, simultaneous exhibitions, and so on. But I wanted a steady job, and I wanted also something that I could enjoy. I wanted a hobby, and I mentioned a number of times in this book, Grandmaster Deadline, that when I had a bad day at my hobby, I could always go back and think about work, which I really enjoyed. And when I had a bad day at work, I could come home and talk about chess and think about chess. So you could say, well, my glass was never half full, but from my point of view, it was always half full. It was at least half full. I was enjoying both things at once.
Yeah, echoes of Mark Taimanov there. Of course, a legendary chess player, but also a renowned classical pianist. And he always would say that about having those dual careers. Did you ever meet Grandmaster Taimanov?
No, I didn't. I missed out on him. There's a number of players that, I wish I had known it when I got a chance. I did get to Russia a couple of times, and I met people like Yuri Averbach and some of the other top players. I mentioned in the book of meeting Mikhail Tal, and it was quite an experience. But of course, I met a huge number of American players, and I realized this is not what I wanted to do. Well, I remember a number of years ago, I saw some young players. Marcy and I had them over for dinner, and I asked, what would you like to be doing in 30 years from now? And I think in the back of their minds they were thinking, well, in 30 years from now I'll have finished my second world championship match with Kasparov. But I said, well, would you like to be giving lessons to kids? Would you like to be giving simultaneous exhibitions? And they said, no way, I'm going to be just still playing. So I met a lot of players who were on their way up, and some of them who were on their way down. And I met a lot of international masters who reached a point in their career. I talked about that in the book, when they realized that they probably were never going to become grandmasters. And some of them who were grandmasters realized, I'm probably not going to become world champion. And that's a terrible thing to have to face. Luckily, I never had to face it.
Yeah, although you had you had some amazing stories in there. So vis-a-vis the grandmaster title, obviously I know you're a grandmaster as I'm reading the book, and you describe your pursuit of the title. I couldn't believe it when I reached the moment in the book. So you have a certain number of norms, and as you wrote in the book, the norms expire at some point. And it's like when you're watching the Titanic. It can be an entertaining movie, but the boat's going to sink at the end, right? And I knew that you were going to get the grandmaster title, but then the norms expired, and I was like, "Wait, what? Can we provide the minor spoiler, Andy, of how it is that when the norms you had acquired to become a grandmaster expired, you managed to still earn the title?"
Yeah, it was a strange situation in those days. The rules for becoming a grandmaster varied, and they changed over the years. But at one time, you had a sort of like a grandmaster clock or an international master clock. You had to achieve all of the norms within a 3-year period. And if you didn't, they ran out. The number of great players from my generation, like Jack Peters and Norman Weinstein, Sal Matera, they achieved their norms, but they couldn't get them all done within the 3 year time limit, so they had to go on to other pursuits. And if you probably know Norman and became enormously successful on Wall Street. Sal had a great career also. We talk about that as being the starting the second part, the middle game of their chess career. Fortunately, I was able to, after many fits and starts, there was a change in the rules and so on. I got my Grandmaster title, but I also told a story about how one of the few benefits of my getting the title was my publishers could put my name and Grandmaster on the cover of a book. But when I went to a bank to cash a check from the USCF, it was written out to GM Andy Soltis, and the bank teller asked, "Well, what does GM stand for?" And I said, "Grandmaster." And the teller was puzzled, and after a while said, which orchestra?
Yeah, it's very funny. There's the cliche like that, and a token will get you on the subway. In this case, the Grandmaster title is almost costing you money because it's making it more difficult for you to cast.
Exactly. The funny thing about becoming a Grandmaster is that actually made me less likely to play in international chess because I didn't need any more norms, and I wasn't going to be sent by the USCF to any foreign tournaments. So I had to find a new way of enjoying chess, which I managed to do.
Yeah, you managed to compete frequently, mainly within the New York area, but you also describe some great travels. And one of my favorite parts of the book is the stories about the various venues you go to, particularly when you do cross paths with the legends. I'd like to get to the Mikhail Tal story, but for example, you describe traveling to India and playing a 16-year-old Viswanathan Anand. What are your memories of that experience?
Well, let me preface that part by saying that the only reason I got to be playing in that tournament, I was the first American to play in an international tournament in India. The only reason I was sent there was because there was a competing tournament in Iceland. Now we're talking about Iceland in February. Actually, I was in Iceland a couple of months ago, in March, May, and it was pretty cold. But all of the American grandmasters preferred to be playing in Reykjavik in February. They passed up this invitation that eventually fell to me to go to India. Anyway, first round of the tournament, I'm playing this 16-year-old kid, and I really didn't know anything about Vishy Anand. I knew something about some of the other players in the tournament because they were famous, Russian grandmasters. But I got something of a little advantage out of the opening. He played quickly, which was, of course, the bane of young players, and Vishy was extremely fast. He played quick moves all the time. And my advantage ran out after 15, 20 moves, and I offered a draw because I couldn't think of another way to improve my position. And he accepted it. And then the next day in the big, Calcutta newspaper, which was the New York Times of Calcutta, they had a headline something like, "Anand holds Soltis to a draw."
So you knew at the time this is worth holding on to.
And of course, every time he played and won in a tournament, I was rooting for him because I had that memorable experience. I could say, "Hey, I knew him when he was younger."
Yeah, and you encountered him again in subsequent years.
Yeah. So over the years, there was one time in the Grandmaster Association tournament in Moscow when he and Marcy and I and Alex Fishbein were trying to find a place where we could spend our rubles and for having a dinner, and we were looking for an Indian restaurant. We walked over, I think, half of Moscow trying to find that restaurant, and they eventually found one place, but they wouldn't accept rubles, looking for dollars. But I chatted with Fund over that time and talked about Indian history and realized how much of an Indian nationalist he was, and fine intellectual mind. And he was one of those rare people who was going to go to college. Nowadays, you look around and you find very few grandmasters of the elite level who have any interest in higher education because they think, well, they made that decision to pass up college when they were young, that was a decision, and they're going to stick with it.
Yeah, although so how old was he at this time? I apologize.
Let's see. I think it must have been a couple of years later.
Okay,
This would
so
have been
still quite young. But you knew by then a potential world champion?
Well, I got that impression. I mean, I realized there were things that he could improve. He could take more than 20 minutes for a chess game.
Right.
He had this quicksilver ability to calculate, and and you can also see then that he had this certain style that was reflected in his moves. The famous Anand knight maneuvers, which became sort of legendary when he was playing at the very top level.
Okay. And then, so again, you've got so many stories of interactions with legends. Returning to the Mikhail Tal story, so you mentioned what it was like to shake his hand.
Yes, I grew up as an absolute Tal fanatic. I read everything that I could find about him. I still have some books that were games that he played when he was very young in Latvia against local players, and I devoured every bit of information that I had about him. And then I got to meet him at a Grandmaster tournament in Moscow. It was after the round, and he was smiled. He shook my hand, and that's when I realized that his hand was missing a couple of fingers, and that absolutely shocked me. I wondered, how was it possible that I had that bit of information had passed me? But of course, in the Soviet Union, they weren't going to report anything like that. And somehow I wondered, how is it that you don't really know that much about the personal lives of great players? And that sent me in another direction. I wanted to write about not just the great moves of players, but also what they were thinking about, what was their life situation, what was their family like, and what internal struggles they were going on. And that led to me to write a number of books for the McFarlane Company about chess history and other great players.
Yeah, including a multi-biography which touches on Tal, which is fantastic. Yeah, and that actually segues, Andy, nicely into our first Patreon mailbag question. This one is from Nahul Marizi. Thank you for helping to support Perpetual Chess, Nahul. And he asks, can you recommend a first book, either your own or another author's, that provides a good overview of Soviet chess history?
That's a good question. The surprising thing was when the Soviet Union fell, which was 34 years ago, I thought that, now the information is going to start pouring out. There are going to be Soviet sources that are going to be revealed to us. And certainly there were, among other aspects of Soviet life, and, more exposés about Stalin and about the terrible living conditions the average Russian lived in. But I was expecting a lot more information about chess. And there were some individual memoirs, Mark Taimanov wrote a couple of them, one of them that hasn't been translated. Yuri Averbach did a couple, and his were translated and so on. But there was no real, sum up book, no book that actually carried the whole story, that told you all about Soviet chess, the history of it, and what it was like for average players to try to make a living. And that's what led me to write my book in 2000. Now, I was expecting, well, now that I got that out, there's going to be all these Russians who are going to be able to do a much better job. I can't tell you that, well, nobody has done anything much better. There have been some wonderful books about aspects of the Soviet championships, for example, about individual players, but I think my book is still the tops.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of your Soviet chess history book. I've said that both when interviewing you and when not. So I think that that's as good a place as any for Nahul to start. And of course, you mentioned one other author I would give a mention to, someone you mentioned in the book as seeing for the first time in Lone Pine, Grandmaster Zhenya Sasanko. I really enjoy his writing. He's got the firsthand perspective that you describe. Yours is more sort of more, his is like firsthand recollections. Yours is like trying to tell someone's whole story. But could you share that story of? I love hearing about these Lone Pine tournaments. I guess you might as well start with how they came to be.
Yeah, there was a very rich man, Louis Statham. He lived originally in Los Angeles. He lived in what later became the Playboy Mansion, but he was an inventor. He had all sorts of other accomplishments in life, and eventually he moved to this remote part of California on the slopes of the Sierras, and he occupied he became the most prominent figure in a town called Lone Pine, which, if you look on the map, well, you'll see, is there anything big near that? Well, there's Bishop, which is a nice name for a chess player. There's a town called Bishop. There's a town called Big Pine. But there's really nothing there except Death Valley is a short distance, and Mount Whitney is in the other direction. And he decided to make that his home, and he decided to have chess tournaments there. And he did something that was sort of unique. He wanted to have instead of having round robin tournaments with just 12 or 14 top players, he would have an international Swiss tournament, which was virtually unheard of in those days. And I remember coming to a tournament in Cleveland in 1975, and there were several players who had just been at the Lone Pine tournament, and they said, well, we had 22 grandmasters. And I was saying, 22 grandmasters in one tournament? That's incredible. And that was the beginning of the international Swiss tournament. The idea that players would go to a place, even as remote as Lone Pine, California, if there was promising prize money, if there was good competition. And that set off a revolution in chess, which continued. It gave birth to the New York Open and a lot of other tournaments in Europe that were modeled after Lone Pine.
Yeah, and there's this evocative moment in the book. So of course, a lot of longtime chess fans, you've inevitably seen games from Lone Pine because so many of the top players did end up gathering there. And then up and coming American players like Jeremy Silman, Kenneth Rogoff, yourself also. But you described this moment, which I hadn't fully internalized. Like, how did the people get from, the former Soviet Union and Greater Europe to this obscure town outside of Southern California? You mentioned they fly into LA and then there was a special bus. So you described the experience of seeing like these people whose names you'd only seen in informants and stuff, like Sasanko and Bent Larson. What was it like to see them for the first time?
It was absolutely shocking. I was like, my God, that's Bent Larson over there reading a novel, and there's some great players. It was like an amazing. What happens if something happens to this bus? The world's top 100 players list is going to be sharply diminished. The thing was that you couldn't get to Lone Pine. There was one bus that one municipal type bus that would get there once a week. So Statham decided to bring the players to his mountain, and he arranged for the players to, if you're showing up in LA, nearby LAX, there would be a bus waiting, and we'll pack everybody into it, and we'll take you on your way. And it's like it was like 2-hour ride or whatever it was. And the players would, talk and chat and bring up and gossip, of course, which is one of the main occupations of grandmasters. I remember one day when there's a free day, as they always had a free day at Lone Pine and it was arranged on a Friday because I think they were always hoping that Bobby Fischer would go there, and they needed Friday free for his religious reasons. And on that, the Friday we would walk around town, and it was amazing because you couldn't miss. There's Lehos Bartish over there, and there's Fedosar Gligorich over there. These are people that I had only read about up till that time. And Ken Rogoff remarked to me, like, the great thing is they have no place to hide.
Right.
They have to be walking on the street because, they're here, and there's nowhere, you're not going to go walking off into Death Valley.
Yeah, and you'd taken some Russian in school. At that age, were you comfortable? Did you try to converse with these Russian legends in Russian or Soviet legends?
No, I didn't try to embarrass myself by doing that. Years later, when we were playing in a Grandmaster tournament in Moscow, Marcy and I were having lunch or dinner, I think it was, in this cafeteria at our hotel, and we tried to have a conversation with Ketevan Arakamia, who was a top woman player. And we were describing how we have an apartment filled with teddy bears, which is one of our hobbies. And we made the mistake of using the word for bear when we should have. There's a specific Russian word for teddy bear. And she said, "Zhivia," meaning they're alive. We had to backtrack there. So no, my Russian is marginal. I mean, if I couldn't put it on a rating scale, but it would probably be above 4 digits, above 1,200, 1,400. But on good days, it could be a master, but not very often.
Yeah, and also with something like Russian, I know you've used it a lot for your research where you have all the time in the world, even pre Google Translate days, you have time to deconstruct what it's saying. Whereas like when you're trying to speak, it's like bullet chess. It's a lot more challenging.
Yes.
Another person that I really enjoyed hearing the stories about is American Grandmaster Walter Browne. So you had a couple of very funny stories about him. Which one comes to mind when I mention that?
Walter and I were growing up at the same time. He was a bit, I think, 1 year younger, and he took chess much more seriously than I did. But somehow I managed to win a couple of games against him early in his career. And there was one game in a Marshall Championship preliminaries. We were trying to get into the championship in those days, and I managed to botch up a winning position in a middle game, but we got to, he eventually, I swindled him in a time pressure. And then he wanted to know, he demanded, we have to look at one position in the game. And that was just before, the very end. What do you got on this? He says to me. And I found I couldn't find a good move. It looked like that he had a winning position then. But the game appeared in the New York Times in Al Horowitz's chess column. And a friend of mine, Mark Yaffe, was a young, promising player, and he had a brother who was, I think, maybe 1600 at his tops. But his brother pointed out a queen sacrifice that I could have used at the end of the game that would have turned the game around. Mark's brother showed it to me, or rather, he showed it to Mark, and Mark showed it to me, and I showed it to Horowitz. And all of a sudden, it became a great game. It appeared in Chess Life, or Chess Review, rather, with annotations by the great Hans Kmock. And he gave me credit for seeing this brilliant queen sacrifice, which of course I didn't. And this game became, circulated around the world, and I became sort of famous for a move that I didn't deserve to play, never saw, and that's my first taste of fame.
Yeah, that was a memorable story, but there was another one. I think it was subsequent to that where he threatened to sue you.
Oh yeah, and the U.S. Championship in 1977, in the last round, he won a great game against Larry Christensen. He needed to win it to win first prize. But what happened was he missed an easier win towards the very end. It was a nice, queen. He could have had another nice queen sacrifice that would have won the game. I wrote about this, and I talked to Larry after the game, and he said that he would have resigned if immediately if Browne had found the sacrifice. And I wrote about this in my New York Post chess column. But Browne went crazy. He apparently saw the game. His parents lived in New York. He saw the column, even though he was living in California. And he wrote an angry letter to the editor of my paper saying that he was going to sue because this was an insult to him. His variations were perfect. How could I possibly insult him? And then this was irreparable slander or something like that. And I had to, and the editor of the paper was sort of incredulous, like, he's suing because of a chess column. And, my editors had been asking me for years, every time there was a notable chess story that came up, they were saying, are all chess players crazy? And I said, well, don't worry about this. I'll calm him down. And I wrote back to Walter. I didn't point out the error in his analysis, but I just sort of said, I got him calmed down. And then I don't know what happened, but years later, whenever there was like a New York Open, we got along amiably. And there was one time when they had the players meeting before the tournament began, when he nominated me to be on the committee that listens to appeals when somebody's complaining about the decision by the arbiter. I talk about in the book how the first time that happened, I had just won a game, very luckily, against Bent Larson. And the next day, there was an appeal to the committee, and I found out that I was on this committee with Bent Larson, and the appeal was coming up about a game that Browne had won, and I was being asked with Larson to judge some, dispute over Browne's game, and I just sort of said, I really don't want to get involved in this. I have sort of a conflict of interest, so I let the other members of the committee, who were Cordish and Larson, make the decision in Browne's favor.
Yeah, there were a lot of funny stories involving Walter Browne, as well as many other players. I also enjoyed the story about him playing two tournaments at once. But yeah, to threaten to sue you for analysis that he considered to be wrong, I couldn't get over that one. And certainly not the only story of the Grandmaster's eccentricities. So, Andy, we've got another Patreon mailbag question related to chess history. This one is from Roy Lopes, and he says, I'm a big fan of your chess writing, especially your multi-biographies. They're both insightful and inspiring to read. Lately, I've been taking a deep dive into the life of the first Soviet chess champion, Alexander Alekhine. I had two questions on this topic. One, do you know the main reasons why a rematch between Alekhine and Capablanca never took place? And two, could you recommend any particular good sources or books on his life and career?
Uh, Okay, let's see. Well, the answer to the first question is very simple. Alekhine just didn't want to play Capablanca. He made up excuses. The main excuse was that he insisted that a rematch be played under the same financial conditions as in their first match. When their first match required that Alekhine find sponsorship in the form of $10,000. And and Alekhine was saying, okay, if you want to play a rematch, then Capablanca has to come up with $10,000. Of course, there was something that happened in between the first match and the possible rematch was the Depression, and the Depression, dried up all of the sponsorship possible funds. And Alekhine went on to play other players for World Championship matches with basically no money and involved. There was a match with Max Erva when Alekhine got a fee for playing the match, but there was no prize money. So Max Erva became world champion and he got the title, but he didn't get any money for winning that match. As to the other question about a good book about Alekhine, there's no single book, but there's a Russian by the name of Sergei Voronsky, and he did a wonderful first volume on Alekhine. I think it's called Russian Sphinx. And it takes his life up to 1921, and I'm eagerly waiting to see the second volume, which will carry along the rest of Alekhine's career. And as far as I know, that's the best thing out there.
Yeah, that book was recently nominated for an ECF Book of the Year. The news came out today, actually, or maybe yesterday as we're recording, that the award actually went to Charles Hurtan for The Real Paul Morphy. So congratulations to Charles. But The Russian Sphinx also has been getting amazing reviews. There's a photo of Magnus Carlsen reading it, and yeah, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it's high on my list as well.
Good, and congratulations to Charlie Hurtan.
Oh yeah, have you ever played him?
Yes, we did. I played him a number of years ago, and we had a tough game. He's a game opponent. He's really tough.
Yeah, as I told him when I interviewed him, FM didn't do him justice, which I didn't realize because I had never had personal interactions with him. I knew him mainly as an author of Forcing Chess Moves and then subsequently The Real Paul Morphy, but you don't normally think of FMs. The default rating is not normally 2,500 USCF, so I was surprised when I dug into that.
Very good.
So we had one more chess history related listener question. This one is from Edward Gonzalez. Thanks for the support, Edward. He asks if there's any plans to do an updated book on the U.S. Championship. It's been 14 years since the last edition. And of course, this is a timely question with the U.S. Championship going on as we record.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I think that probably the publisher would be interested, but I'm not. I've sort of have done that book 3 times, and I really don't have any great ambition to update it. And by the way, that's Edward Gonzalez, right?
Yep.
He has done some wonderful work on statistics for the U.S. Championship. And he can tell you, all sorts of the shortest ever games and the longest ever games and who has streaks and that type of stuff. So if somebody wants to update that book, they should talk to Edward, and they might be able to collaborate.
Yeah, sounds like Edward might need to get involved himself. Shout out. Yeah, we met at a New York event once as well. True chess fan, Edward is. So many stories, Andy, from this book. I've got to get a few more highlights if you don't mind. So in one of our prior interviews, we, of course, discussed Bobby Fischer. You have this, as we discussed in a prior interview, one of my favorite chess photos of all time of you playing him in a blitz tournament, the only time you got to play him. But you told another story that I don't believe we had covered in prior interviews. related to Lone Pine, actually. So you went to visit Grandmaster Peter Biasis after the tournament, and perhaps you could take it from there, Andy?
Yeah, we had dinner. Marcy and I had dinner with Ruth Herring and Peter Biasis, who were married, and they invited us to their place after the tournament. San Francisco is not that far from Lone Pine. Marcy and I took the bus out to where they live in the Richmond district, which is just north of Golden Gate Park. Peter was at the door, but Ruth was still working downtown in the financial district. And but then she came in, and very quickly she arranged a full turkey dinner, and that puzzled me because Peter is very talented, but cooking is not one of his skills. He could barely turn on. He could basically boil water, I think, would be a challenge. And we where did this come from? Well, they didn't give us an answer until years later, and the explanation was that their house guest was Bobby Fischer. He had been staying with Peter and Ruth for a while. I think he crashed around various places in California at the time, and he played many speed games with Peter, and he later told us that how Fischer aggravated him by telling Peter that he had to work on his end game, and Peter's favorite part of the game was the end game. But this was all revealed many, many years later. And I realized, the reason why, Bobby wasn't going to show a trace of himself there was because he knew that I was a reporter. And, I hadn't seen him actually since he won the World Championship in 1972. And there was a special event at City Hall in his honor. And we chatted at that point. But I think he was just afraid of having any contact with a reporter.
Yeah, amazing story. You never know. You never know who's behind a closed door.
That's right.
And you describe in your book at another point where you were trying to track him down for an interview. And in those days, obviously, way pre cell phone. So you would just go to his haunts and hope to run into him.
Well, I think this was before the World Championship match in '72, and Sport Magazine was then very popular, trying to become the rival of Sports Illustrated, and they wanted to do their first chess article, and they want to do a big profile of Bobby, and I tried to track him down in various places. There was like an automat restaurant in New York where you put nickels into a machine and it would feed you a cup of coffee and various things like that. That was one of his favorite hangouts. But he was then staying at the Yale Club in New York. I have no idea what the connection was there. Maybe one of his lawyers went to Yale, and I tried to get in there, and that failed. And I kept talking to his lawyers and asking them, when can I talk to Bobby? And there was no chance of doing that. I would need to get the article into Sports Illustrated, or rather Sport Magazine. I would need to get photographs because, of course, that's what the lifeblood of a magazine like that. And Bobby just had no interest. They kept putting me off, and eventually gave up on it.
Yeah, and so the last time you saw him, as you said, was that event after he won the World Championship?
Yeah, there was. We were all sitting on a big dais for Summer House, and I was sitting there too at City Hall in New York. And I remember one of the funny aspects of that was that Tony Sadie, who is a good friend of Bobby's, international master Anthony Sadie, he came rushing at the last minute and gave Bobby a piece of paper. And there was speculation that Sadie was some sort of lawyer who was serving him legal papers. He was being sued. But it turns out Sadie was giving him remarks.
Okay.
So that he could sound intelligence when he talked about how chess was surprising, that even today you can see that Pravda does not mention chess anymore because of what happened in Reykjavik.
Yeah, and Tony Sadie being a doctor, not a lawyer, of course.
Yeah.
And one more thing that I was struck by in the book, Irving Chernev's work has come up a lot over the years here on the podcast. Obviously, some of his books are legendary, and I'm always amazed how well they stand the test of time, particularly compared to some of the other older chess books. Of course, I'm referring to like Logical Chess, Move by Move, and the most instructive chess games ever played. But you described some letter correspondences with Irving Chernev.
Yeah, he wrote me one of my first book came out. It was a little pamphlet that I wrote basically for the USCF. They were trying to find different ways of staving solvent in those days. It was a collection of Boris Spassky's games. And out of the blue, Irving Chernev sent a letter to the USCF, which was passed on to me, in which he said, really enjoyed this book. You did a remarkable job. You picked some wonderful games. You had some surprisingly interesting notes. You should keep doing this. You should do Lasker, do Alekhine, do Capablanca. And I was very flattered by that. Of course, what was a greater honor? If I had beaten Bobby Fischer in the speed game, that would have been do it. But being praised by Irving Chernev and told to keep writing about chess. But that came at exactly the point in my career when I thought, well, no, I'm starting my life as a newspaper reporter. I'm never going to write about chess ever again.
Which didn't turn out to be true. Far from it.
Didn't turn out to be true. Well, yes. As I say in the book, I'm terrible at thinking more than one move ahead in my life.
And Irving, he lived in, I know he was born in Ukraine, but he lived in New York, right?
He lived in New York for many years, and then he moved to San Francisco. I didn't know him then. And he wrote me a number of times. And at one point, I asked him for contributions to a book on the book of chess lists. And did he have something that he could add? And he wrote me a nice letter and said, yes, I'll get to it, but I have a small impediment. He used a French term. I think he had some medical matter, and that turned out badly, and he died a short time later, and I never got that contribution for that book of chess lists. I did get contributions from other people, including Walter Browne, but that's one thing I missed out on.
And you never got to meet Irving Chernev in person?
Never got to meet him, no. No, I met a lot of the other people. And in fact, I also talked in the book about how, of course, I never got to meet Fred Reinfeld, but I was a co-author with Fred Reinfeld because after the Fischer-Spassky match, the publishers were just desperate for anything about chess. So I ended up meeting with Beatrice Reinfeld, who is Fred's widow, and she had some. She was searching through his old manuscripts to see if there's anything that hadn't been published by Fred Reinfeld that could come out now. And we did end up collaborating, in a sense, on a book of Paul Morphy's games. And I edited it and I changed some things. I added a couple of games and I wrote them, the annotations in the Fred Reinfeld style. But one thing that struck me is that after this meeting with Beatrice Reinfeld, she said, there is this manuscript of Fred did his own game anthology, the best games of Fred Reinfeld, but she said, I'm afraid this would never sell. And, at the time I had to agree, but, nowadays, if a book of Fred Reinfeld's best games came out, written by Fred Reinfeld, anything is going to be published nowadays in chess. And that book, that kind of niche book, probably would appear.
Yeah. Yeah. And one more on the topic of Chernev. So he, from what I've read, was probably about a 2200 level player. There's been, at times in chess, certainly a strain of elitism. Sometimes you even hear it with modern YouTubers, people like Levy not being a grandmaster, Levy Rosman, even though he's extremely strong. Or Agadmator might get looked down upon by the very top players, or at least there might be a bit of jealousy. Now, Irving Chernev, you write in the book, he had a day job, but still one of the most successful authors, certainly then, and now obviously his legacy, he still sells, probably thousands of books every year. Did you feel, or did anyone you encounter feel, was there like jealousy or dismissal of his writing as a player who was not like an international master or a grandmaster?
No, because he didn't write in a pretentious manner, and he wasn't claiming to be a very strong player. He did play in one U.S. championship in, I think, the late 30s, the early 40s, where he didn't do terribly well, but the fact that he got into the finals of the U.S. championship was remarkable. He had a remarkable ability to appeal to players across the board, across the rating spectrum, which a lot of others did not. And a lot of other writers write too high. They write for, basically they write for fellow grandmasters. Whenever I see something in someone annotating a game not very well known, it seems they're writing for players who are rated 200 points higher than them, or they're writing as if, they are that much stronger. A 2100 player annotates a game in the style of a 2300 player, and a 2300 player writes, as if he's talking to a 2500 player. And they're sort of missing the point because the vast majority of readers are just not there.
Right. Yeah. Well said. And Andy, that brings us to our last topic, your new book, Reveal Your Chess Style. So I'm holding it up, Andy. This is my portion of the interview will be on camera on YouTube. Yours is going to be just a still photo. But in any event, this book, a very unique idea of the presentation. So could you, A, describe the presentation a bit, and B, tell us how you came to this idea?
Yeah, well, every player has a style. Everyone who's been playing in tournaments for a while has a particular preference for certain moves. I'm not talking about skill here. The skill has nothing to do with it. It's a question of moves. In a typical position, if there's not a forcing move, if you don't have to recapture the other guy's queen or you're going to lose, you have a choice of moves. And your choice of the decisions you make are a clue to your chess personality, or as I call it, your style. And the trouble is that most players don't know what their own style is. They think I play like Mikhail Tal, and in fact they're making Anatoly Karpov moves or something like this. So I decided to work, see if I could find examples of positions or typical positions in which you have a choice of reasonable moves. And so there are like 100 diagrams in this book, and each one, at the bottom below the diagram, there's a choice of 3, 4, or 5 alternative moves. And it asks you, just pick the move you think is best. This is not a white to play and win situation because there is no win. In fact, there's probably no best move. But then after you make your choices, and then several pages later, the same diagrams will appear. Only this time, there's going to be an explanation. And the explanation of if you pick that move, reflects you have certain tendencies of this particular player. And it could be, very wide. There was one position, and there were actually 7 different reasonable choices. And they're pretty much all the same in terms of value. There's none of them is really spectacular. But one move would have likely have been played by Aaron Nimzovich. Another would have been played by Tigran Petrosian. Another by Bent Larson, for example. Frank Marshall or David Bronstein would have played another move. And it goes on like this. And when you go through the book, you begin to get some clues as to how you really play. And this is the type of book that I kind of thought about this, some years ago, but it was only because of the advent of computers that I was able to put it together, because there's always been this conflict between there was a debate basically between Siegbert Tarrasch, the great German player, 100 years ago. He said that every chess position is a puzzle, and your task is to find the solution to the puzzle. There's only one solution. And his rival, Aaron Nimzovich, said, no. In every position, there's probably going to be 2 good moves. And you can try to figure out which one's better, but you do have choices. And now that we have computers, they sort of solve the answer. They know that the real answer is probably close. The truth is closer to Nimzovich, because in the vast majority of positions that you're going to face in life, in a chess position, there really are choices. There's several moves that are reasonably good. One of them is not going to be 0.50 more than the other. They're all going to be about the same. And so I collected these positions, and each of these diagrams, the computer says, there really isn't much difference in A and B and C. So this is not going to be a test of your skill, but it is a reflection of your style, your chess handwriting, as it were. And there are ways of changing it, just as you can possibly try to change your handwriting. But there are other ways that you can, once you know your style, that you can improve your playing ability.
So do you come down more in the work on your weaknesses or lean into your strengths school of thought?
Yeah, there's 2 ways of looking at this. If you discover, for example, that you play like Vishy Anand,
that would be a welcome and surprising discovery.
Yes, that would, and you really haven't looked at Anand games. How is it possible that you play like Anand, but you haven't really looked at Anand games? Well, that certainly because you have this predilection for certain types of aggressive moves, certain pawn moves, and certainly his famous knight moves. Well, then you can become a better player by studying Anna. After all, if you share something in common with him, find out what more you can learn from him. And the other way of looking at it comes from the fact that, the top players today really do not have styles
I
because
was going
they
to ask
all
you about
have the
that.
same.
Yeah.
They all have the universal style. I mean, you cannot, if you saw a game and you didn't know which player, whether white or black, was Nakamura and which one was Caruana, or which one was Wesley Slow and which one was MVL, you really couldn't tell because they all play more or less alike because they have learned that they can play in depending on the position they can play like Morphy, or if it's a different position they can play like Karpov. um, and so if you go through these diagrams and it turns out, say in the positional section, there's, I think, 12 positional oriented diagrams, that you never picked the Rubinstein move in any of those positions. That should tell you something, because, Rubinstein was really exceptional and he had a particular style. That's something that's missing in your toolbox. That's something you can learn, something you can work on, and it's fairly easy because nowadays, you can just click on a database and look at 50 Rubinstein games. It's not a question of like deeply studying them 4 hours on each game. No, you can get the flow of a Rubinstein game fairly well. They have a remarkable flow to them, and that's something that any player can do.
Yeah, good advice. As long as we don't become super grandmasters, and then we might be too good to have such a weakness to need to address. So Andy, you write at the end of Deadline Grandmaster, your fingers will never stop typing. So what's next?
Well, I'm sort of stumped right now for a book. I'm trying to come up with an idea. I want to write something that, I don't want to write the type of book that everyone else has written. And the number of books there's so many different aspects of chess that have been covered by other players. And that, it's a funny thing that's what's going on in the chess book business nowadays, because there are just so many more books being published, so many more publishers out there than there ever had been before. And even what's striking is the number of hardcover books, because you remember when there were no hardcover books being published. And then in the last 20 years or so, hardcover books are coming back. So we have a sort of a revolution in chess publishing today. And I've asked various people. Well, one person I asked recently over lunch was a former librarian and also still a grandmaster. That was Jim Tarjan. And I asked him, can you explain what's going on here? Why are all these books coming out when supposedly the prime consumer of chess books are kids? And kids were being constantly told, don't read. They don't like print anymore. Why are books selling when they shouldn't? He didn't have an answer. And what I've been hearing from chess booksellers and publishers is that the real consumer nowadays are the people who are coming back to chess in their 20s and in their 30s after a lapse, and they're the ones. And in fact, they're also the ones who think, maybe I should get a hardcover version. It's become like a niche favorite, like the people who collect vinyl records rather than Spotify. They want to have something they can keep.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're on Facebook, but the Facebook chess collectors group, last I looked, had something like 40,000 members. A lot of people with photos showing off their chess books. So it's all them, basically.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, I'm interested. I'm curious if, I wrote a book that did decently, did well for a chess book at least. But I am curious, writ large, how chess books are selling, because I don't know if it's that they're selling, if it's because also I feel like the cost of production has come down a little bit. So it might be that you have a lower hurdle for what makes a book viable, where you at least are going to get your money back. I'm not sure, but it's a welcome. I never get tired of them, and I know that you've got plenty more to write.
Yeah, you can do also. You can. There's a lot of self-published books. People, make an arrangement with Amazon, which will help publish your book. There's a lot of that going on,
Yeah.
and the publishers used to, have basic rules about, they need to publish at least 2,000, 3,000 copies to start out. But you can do something in a very small batch and see if 500 copies were sell. I remember when my first book was published by the USCF. Edmondson, I think, was considering, maybe we'll publish 100 copies and see if anybody buys it. Actually, I think they did very well. They sold out very quickly, and that's what they told that there was a market for books like that. Another revolution that took place many years ago when very cheap books could come out rather than the hardcovers, and people were buying books that sold for just $1 or $2. I think my first book sold for $2.50.
Yeah, although as Grandmaster Jakob Aagaard has written, chess books are still a good deal. The problem is all of us want to buy like 20 of them. But each in the individual, their cost hasn't risen as many as other things have when you adjust for inflation.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that the ebooks were supposed to be taking off by now, and chess ebooks just don't sell very well. People really want to have something in their hands. Every so often there's talk in the USCF about getting rid of Chess Life and getting rid of the print magazine and just having a website which you can have the Chess Life content on that. But that would never work because people want to have something physical in their hands. During COVID, the only contact that a lot of people had with the USCF among the membership was once a month they could be certain that they were going to get a magazine. So I think that even just the tactile nature of getting something that you can look at in your hand and look and go page by page is something refreshing and something that will be enjoyable for as long as anybody's interested in chess.
Yeah. I mean, I myself would often prefer a physical chess book, but my wife would definitely prefer no more chess books. So she's in favor of the ebooks.
What do you do with your books? Do you have like bookcases or?
Yeah, some of them are behind me. Those watching on YouTube will be able to see. Yeah, I mean, I've given some away. And I do try to read electronically as much as I can, especially because I'm often interviewing authors before the books come out. So it's like, just get me something the fastest, rather than the beautiful hardback. But certainly, if I were to end up with a bigger house and more disposable income, I could easily see myself going deeper down the chess book collection rabbit hole. Oh, I don't know how
Yeah,
likely those things are.
yeah, I'm trying to get rid of some of my books. I gave a bunch of them away to the Marshall Chess Club just recently. I still have maybe 500 or so still to dispose of, and the flow keeps building up because when you think you're dispensed with quite a few of them, and you realize, well, there's another cartridge, another over there that I haven't looked at. And I tend to follow the Botvinnik rule. Botvinnik had a personal habit of thinking that if there's anything in his home that he hasn't used in recent years, if he hasn't used this utensil in the kitchen in the last 5 years, time to get rid of it because if you're not going to, it's just not part of your life. And I'm afraid to say that I have to do that with some of my chess books.
Yeah, yeah. I think we all do, especially because you've got the teddy bears competing for space. So
Yes, exactly. And of course, the bears are permanent. They're never going to be leaving.
right. Um, well, Andy, a pleasure as always to catch up. Definitely, when you do figure out your next project, I, as always, would be happy to discuss it.
That's great. I love being on your show, Ben. This is really entertaining for me too.
Oh, well, thanks. And again, for listeners, so if you're working on your chess, want to flesh out whose games to study, reveal your chess style, and really love Deadline Grandmaster. I know a lot of people listening really enjoy the stories. And yeah, I just couldn't put it down over the past handful of days. So yeah, thanks again, Andy. And look forward to chatting again sometime in the future.